Welcome to The Faithful Steward. This is a podcast all about sharing biblical wisdom and practical insights in order to help church leaders pursue and teach financial freedom as part of Christian discipleship. We believe this is a spiritual conversation, and this is a place where the church needs to lead the way in order to move our communities forward in how we steward God's resources. I'm your host, James Lenhoff, and I am so passionate about this conversation and helping leaders have the confidence to step into it. We believe that if we help people thrive financially and grow spiritually, it changes everything. And I am so excited to join you on this journey. This podcast is brought to you by Good Sense. If you'd like more information about what we're up to, you can go to our website at goodsensemovement.org. All right, let's get started with today's conversation. Well, today I want to talk about a topic that is looming for our entire country. Generationally, we are about to step into the largest wealth transfer through inheritance that we have seen in the history of our nation. This is the baby boomer generation that, as they pass on, is transitioning their wealth to a generation that I would argue is largely unprepared for what is going to land in their lap. And this experience of inheritance can be really difficult. If you are in a leadership position in your church, you're going to see this happen as some of your long-standing families see the matriarch and patriarch pass away. If you are in an age bracket where you're sandwiched between your revolving door kids, like we talked about recently on the podcast, and your older parents, this is something that you might even be wrestling with personally. But either way, we need to be prepared. We need to make sure we're teaching how to approach inheritance wisely and with a mindset that is aimed towards stewardship, because this experience of wealth being kind of dumped on your lap can be devastating. A lot of times the assumption is that people who inherit money get this experience of freedom and joy, and it makes all their problems go away, a lot like many times we think of lottery winners, that there's just this sudden experience of freedom from fear and anxiety and worry because they have all this money. Many times I see families struggle under the weight of the experience of that inheritance, and it's really confusing. Why is it so hard to inherit money? It seems like it should be a really exciting thing that your parents or your relatives somehow set aside enough to give you a windfall. But that, in most of the cases, is part of the problem. This is money that's not earned. This is money that comes with a lot of relational attachment. And so it can be really difficult to be able to steward it wisely because we're wrestling with so much emotion. In the moment when that inheritance comes down, many times we can feel the sense of obligation that we need to honor whoever that came from. If it's our parents, we need to make sure that we're doing what they would want us to do, and we feel this burden to do it right. We feel like we don't deserve it. We didn't earn the money. We didn't make the money. They did. Why do I get it? Why did I end up with it? And so we can feel guilt. We can feel a lot of shame, particularly if we find ourselves in a financial situation where we are behind, we have not saved well, we are racking up debt, and then this inheritance comes in and kind of bails us out. It actually can foster a sense of inadequacy, that we weren't able to do these things ourselves. Our parents or our grandparents or whoever it was that left us this money ultimately took care of us, and we can tell ourselves a story that we are failures. There's also a long history of family dynamics that come along with that inheritance. If your parents really never talked about money, if this was a topic that they avoided, sometimes you can feel this overwhelm because now all of a sudden you're discovering what they had and they never told you, they never let you in. Maybe there's even some resentment for the fact that you struggled, and all of a sudden now you find out they could have been helping you all along. And it would have been so much more helpful along the way rather than all at once. Maybe there's family dynamics because the way that the assets are inherited is different across the family. Maybe your siblings got a different share or a different setup than you did, and you can pour salt in some wounds that might already exist there. Maybe your parents were really controlling, really demanding. And so when this money comes down to you, you can almost hear them telling you what to do with it. And you feel this need to obey them. And so all of these emotions get really mixed in with this sudden experience of wealth that you haven't been used to before. You know, I say all the time that the hardest part of money is the having of it. And so often when those resources get passed down, really quick decisions get made, things that we maybe have always wanted to do or wanted to buy. We kind of rush out and medicate some of that emotion by using those resources recklessly. And then we feel shame about the fact that we use those resources recklessly. We can almost hear that parent telling us that we shouldn't have done that. All of those emotions get mixed up with the loss of this relationship in the midst of our mourning. There's so many moving parts a lot of times, particularly if it's a large inheritance. There's probably trusts involved and different layers of documents that need to be navigated. And so it can be a really long and confusing process that leaves us wishing we never had it. Many times people feel this confusion of this gift that their parents gave them, and yet their resentment of that gift. And so if you are in a leadership position, or if this is something that you're facing yourself, the most important thing as we approach those conversations to help people in the midst of these times of transition and difficulty is making sure we are curious, making sure we're leaning in and asking great questions, giving those people an opportunity to share openly what they're dealing with without judgment. A lot of times, if someone just inherited some resources, they don't feel like they're able to say that they're struggling or that they're frustrated or that they're confused or they resent it, because anyone would trade places with them. In their minds, what do I have to complain about? My parents just took great care of me. Who am I to feel these negative emotions and be struggling with this? It doesn't make any sense. And so they don't feel like they're allowed to share those things with people. It's a great opportunity for us to step in and give those individuals that are wrestling through this a space to wrestle, to be heard and understood and seen and known. That is one of the most valuable gifts that we can give to another person and honestly to ourselves, is just the authentic processing of this confusion, because it is a confusing time. There's no question, and there's no avoiding it. Once we have kind of wrestled through those things, then we want to actually start to step into faithful stewardship with these resources, because God is calling us to faithful stewardship of all of his resources, whether they were resources that we earned through our work or they were resources that were given to us through gifts like an inheritance. We need to make sure that we recognize his ownership of all of that and that we're asking him what he would have us do with it. And it's really important. We're asking him. He's the owner, not our parents, not our grandparents, not the person who gave you that gift through the inheritance. God is the owner of those resources. And so we need to be seeking out his guidance and his wisdom, not feeling this sense of obligation that we have to do what our parents would tell us to do with those resources. Now, let me be clear. We do want to honor the person who was thoughtful enough and provided this abundance through their self-sacrifice, through their willingness to not spend all the resources that they had. When we have these types of generational wealth transfers, we want to recognize and honor that those people made decisions that led to this abundance. And so sometimes that looks like doing things that they wish we would have done, not because we feel obligated, but because we see it as an opportunity to honor their thoughtfulness, their provision. So maybe there's a cause that they care about specifically that we may not have been super connected to, but as we think about being generous with these resources, we give some of those resources to those causes that our parents cared about the most. Maybe it's that there was a dream that they had for us, that we would pursue a certain level of education, or that we would be able to provide for our kids to have a shared experience. And we honor them by making space for those kinds of experiences. Those are the kinds of things we do want to consider. We want to seek God's guidance. We want to be in obedience to the owner, the ultimate owner of the resources. But that doesn't mean we don't honor the person who ultimately passed this gift down to us through the inheritance. It's one way to resolve some of that discontent and some of that tension, to feel like we have somehow given something back to that person by honoring the things they cared about. For many people who are experiencing this windfall, this is the largest amount of money they've ever had. And so they can very quickly start to believe that they have freedom, that they get to do whatever they want, that they can spend recklessly, that they can buy the things they've always wanted, they can indulge in their self-gratification. And that is a really difficult tendency to fight against, because all of the experience they've had so far has probably been rooted in self-denial, some level of guilt for times that they did spend money that they didn't have, or they got tight in their spending plan because they overspent in certain categories. And there's this push-pull that happens in the life before the windfall. The windfall can break away a lot of those restrictions. And if we're not careful, we can fall into the traps of self-indulgence. We can take this idea of ownership too far and say, I get to do whatever I want with it. I get to enjoy, instead of continuing to deny myself. One of the hardest things in this season of transition, of getting used to the having of these resources, is continuing the disciplines that were in place before that windfall happened. So if you have been intentionally stepping into faithful stewardship by tracking your expenses, by being really thoughtful in how you're using God's resources, don't let those disciplines fall to the wayside simply because there's so much of an abundance. I actually think we need to double down on those disciplines when there is an abundance, because it's so easy to get lax in our stewardship because there's more than enough. But when there is more than enough, I actually believe we are held to a higher level of accountability. What did we do with the abundance? How did we honor the owner with his resources? We need to make sure we have community around us, that we are stepping into those relationships that will remind us that discipline is healthy, that we need to hold on to those things, that we don't want to become reckless and spendthrift and end up wasting God's resources just because we can. One of the other things that can happen here that is really difficult to navigate is that we can make commitments to a future based on our initial feeling of freedom. What I mean by that is we can see this windfall and say, we're going to go buy a second home. We're going to go buy the sports car. We're going to go take on debt because we have all this money coming in. And so we're going to go ahead and spend it before we even really have it, because we see this freedom coming. We actually waste those resources. We set up a commitment to make payments on something for a long period of time before we've even cashed the check, so to speak, before that inheritance has even come into our account. We've spent it over the next 5 or 6 or 30 years because we proactively bought things before we even had the resources in our accounts. Those trip us into a level of lifestyle that is hard to recover from. Once we elevate those spending plans, once we have committed ourselves to ongoing monthly costs, now we are stuck in those patterns, and that becomes our new normal. And so before we go changing anything, I would always recommend that we settle in, let the dust clear, let the emotions clear, let the mourning of the loss of the relationship happen. Get to a place where you have settled yourself before anything changes. Don't go changing anything just on the expectation of this windfall. And even once that windfall's in place, wait, take a breath, understand yourself, understand your tendencies, work through the emotion. This is a really emotionally charged season for families for lots of different reasons. Let that work itself out before you start making long-term commitments to a whole nother league of lifestyle that immediately adds stress to a situation that was supposed to bring you freedom. This is a wonderful time to reevaluate your non-negotiables and understand what your priorities are for your family. This can change some of the way that you think about those things, but the underlying priorities, the things that are most important to you, really shouldn't change. How you're living them out may change. You may have some more money for shared experiences. You may take an extra trip or two. You may be able to give more generously than you were before. Those are all wonderful things, but they should be an opening up of priorities that are already core to who you are as a family. And so if we don't remind ourselves who we are, what's most important, what we're choosing to pick up, and what we need to put down as a result of that non-negotiable process that we talk about, we need to make sure we have all of those things fresh in our mind, decided again as a family. Choose these things before this money comes in, before there's this big change in your situation. Remind yourself the things that don't change. This is what our family is about. These are the things we care the most about. This is the stuff we are prioritizing and will continue to prioritize no matter what the numbers look like. Those are the kinds of things we need to reset ourselves on so that we don't end up being sucked into the lure of more. So let's get really practical. As we think about the actual application of some of these resources, one really great use of these resources is to get yourself back to solid footing. And so if you have accumulated a lot of credit card debt, if you are in a situation where your interest costs are becoming unbearable and then this windfall comes in, don't spend it. Use it to get back to solid ground by paying off all those high interest debts. That is a wonderful use of those resources, but it doesn't mean that now that those are gone, you can re-up and spend that money again. We want to actually use this to get to a place where we have regained that margin that we've lost, and then we settle into a pattern that's more sustainable, more comfortable, less anxious, and less stressful. And so we want to use these resources to free ourselves from some of those things rather than just spending it and continuing to get further into that tension. If you have not prioritized saving, if you look at your overall net worth and it has not been growing over time because you have been spending your resources rather than saving them, I would argue that this is a great time to get yourself back to where you should be. And so if you are way behind on your saving and you get a windfall, that does not mean that you have extra. It means you got caught up. And we need to recognize when we are just back to where we should have been all along, rather than getting this sense that we're way ahead just because we have more money than we ever have had. That doesn't necessarily mean that we are wealthy enough to be reckless. We need to understand our net worth. We need to be intentional about growing it over time. If this windfall is just catching our net worth up to the starting line of where we should be right now, we need to recognize that, and our behavior needs to reflect that. We didn't just get rich. We got back to where we should have been. And now the behaviors and the disciplines that need to be put in place might be easier to put in place now because some of those pressures are off, but we still need to be intentional about those disciplines. We still need to be saving adequately, paying debt down adequately. We still need to be intentional about our net worth growth. And so often, just because these things come in a lump sum, the assumption is that we can blow it. That is probably not true. And so really work with a financial planner, get some guidance from outside counsels, some people that can tell you where you really are and what you should be prioritizing with these resources so that you can have the confidence that you're on track for the future that God is calling you to. And so finally, as we think about that type of season of these big windfalls coming in, one thing that I find really helpful is to tap into gratitude. If these resources have bought you back some of the ground that you were not able to make up on your own, they've gotten you back to where you should be grateful that you are now safer than you were. If these resources are buying your family some experiences that your parents had longed for you to have, Cherish those things. Revel in it. No shame, no guilt, no sense of entitlement, like I deserve. I want to encourage those families who are in these seasons to hold tight to gratitude. That this is not something that you have earned, that you have built on your own, that you deserve. It is a gift. Be grateful for it, but recognize it is still all God's. Because it's very easy when these windfalls come into our lap that we can step into entitlement and ownership. I deserve it, and it's mine. I get to do whatever I want with it. Hold very tightly to it's not mine. I am a steward, and I am deeply grateful for the gift of being able to manage it for God's kingdom, for His glory, and step into obedience for what the owner of the resources would have you do with the windfall to honor the folks that sent it your way and to honor God who ultimately always owns it no matter what. Well, thank you so much for listening to the Faithful Steward podcast. Be sure to check out the show notes for links and other information that we mentioned in today's episode. Also, be sure to check out our website at goodsensemovement.org to get all the resources we offer churches to help equip them in teaching financial stewardship to their community. If you have any questions or any topics you want to make sure we cover on our show, you can email me at jameslenhoff@goodsensemovement.org. I'd love to hear from you.